caveat that with the fact that this airplane is scheduled to be released by the F-35 Strike Fighter, but that airplane is actually still in the production stages. So the F-15 remains in service for not only the U.S. military, but most of our allies as well. Now, right next to it is its predecessor there on the left-hand side. That is the F-4 Phantom. This was the fixed-wing superstar during the Vietnam campaign. This was the plane that did all of the MiG killing and the napalm dropping, and the aircraft that did most of the work for not only the Air Force. This one is in Air Force colors, but this is the one that the Navy and Marine Corps were also flying as well. The one thing that you'll notice that the F-4 Phantom does not have is machine guns. If you look carefully at that aircraft, there are no guns on board that aircraft at all. But we were in the technologically advanced 70s, and at that point, dogfights were no longer being done nose to nose. They were being done more in the measure of miles rather than yards or feet. So they equipped the aircraft with Sidewinder and Sparrow missiles rather than machine guns. Well, they would find in later days that they actually could use some machine guns on board that aircraft, so they would actually put a machine gun on the center line on the belly of that F-4 Phantom in later years or later on in the aircraft. So we're going to be on the left-hand side here. I'm going to talk about these two big green Air Force airplanes that we're looking at here. We've got a pair of F-105 Thunder Chiefs, thugs, as they were called by the guys that flew them. That first one there with WW on the tail is the Wild Weasel version of the F-105. Now, Wild Weasel was a very good mission set for the U.S. military. That crew would actually fly that airplane up the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Then when the Viet Cong turned on their ground radar on that airplane, the Wild Weasel crew would fire what they call a Harm missile, an anti-radiation missile, right down that radar beam, hopefully destroying that big radar site so that the attack aircraft would be behind the Wild Weasels, but then not be targeted by enemy radar. It was a good mission set, but they had a very high casualty rate, being first in and last out with the F-105s and the Wild Weasels. One right next to it there with Big Sal on the leading edge of the wing there is the bombing configuration of the F-105 Thunder Chief. You can see the bomb rack on the bottom there, allowing that aircraft to carry up to 13,000 pounds of bombs on board. Now swing around to the right-hand side. I'm going to talk about that gray jet, or I'm sorry, the green camouflage jet over here on the right-hand side. That is the F-100 Super Sabre. That was an Air Force fighter that was mostly Korean War era type of aircraft, and that was one that the Air Force guys were flying during that particular era. This was also the Air Force's very first supersonic jet fighter, faster than the speed of sound, intelligence gathering aircraft. These were a favorite of the guys that flew them. They had the lowest accident rate of any military jet fighter, and they held a number of speed records for a lot of years. The F-101 included. Okay, back around to the left-hand side, we've got three what are called FAC aircraft, FAC, Forward Air Controller aircraft. These were Vietnam-era aircraft. Number 901, way down there on the far end there, is an O-2A, and that was flown by the Air Force. Number 02 in the middle there is an OV-10 Bronco. And closest to us here, the Dirty Dog, is an OV-1 Mohawk flown by the Army during Vietnam. Now what these guys would do, the forward air controllers, they would fly up the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and then when they found targets on the ground of the enemy, they would drop what they called Willie Pete's, or white phosphorus grenades, out of these observation aircraft to mark those targets on the ground for attack aircraft that would follow in behind. Now look closely at the nose gear landing door on the Dirty Dog here closest to us, and you'll see 4 little red hearts there. Those actually indicate that the Dirty Dog was damaged 4 times in combat and returned to service for the U.S. Army all 4 times. Over on our right-hand side, we have one of our newest additions to our collection here. This is a Royal Navy Westland Lynx attack helicopter, flown by the Royal Navy of Britain right up until 2015, when the aircraft was retired and delivered to our museum a few months back. Alrighty, as we turn the corner here, take a look out the left-hand side. We're going to have a couple of twin-engine, originally civilian aircraft that were later pressed into military service. And the first one there in Navy paint is the Piper U-11A Aztec. The Navy used that as a twin-engine trainer with a light cargo hauler. The dark blue one there in Air Force colors is the Cessna U-3A, known as the Blue Canoe. That was also a twin-engine trainer for the Air Force, as well as a twin-engine light cargo hauler. It was also the chase plane for the U-2 spy plane. That is a Cessna 310 in the civilian world, for those of you that are familiar. And for those of you that are old enough to remember Sky King, that was the Songbird, the Cessna 310 there. Okay, right next to the 310, the big silver cargo plane that we're looking at is the Bud Conestoga. The Air Force, or I'm sorry, the U.S. was very concerned during World War II that we were going to have an aluminum shortage. So they contracted the Bud Corporation to build these big cargo planes out of welded stainless steel rather than riveted aluminum. Well, here's the kicker. The Bud Corporation was not in the airplane building business. They built welded stainless steel railroad box cars. But they actually did agree to build 600 of these for the military. And then when the aluminum shortage did not materialize, the military canceled the order for all but 18 aircraft. Those 18 were delivered, but they never went into military service. They ended up going to work for the Flying Tigers. The big triple-engine aircraft ahead and to the left, another cargo airplane. This is a YC-125 Raider, built by the Northrop Corporation. It's a tactical transport airplane. Not very popular here in North America. The Raider was actually losing business to helicopters of its day that could carry about the same payload as the Raider. But although not popular here, very popular down in Central and South America for getting in and out of those rougher and less improved runways down in those particular areas. Now we've got a commuter plane coming up on our left-hand side here, this yellow one with the two engines. This is a Martin 404. Back in the mid-50s, pretty much all of the airlines of the day, TWA, Pan Am, Eastern, Continental, United, all had 404s as their regional airliner. If you picked one of these up, though, you would want to make sure that it did not have a cylinder head sticking out through the right engine cowling. This airplane obviously has a story to tell. This was our museum's free airplane. It was given to us by an estate up in Wyoming. All we had to do was go get it. So one of our docents went up there to go get this airplane, and on the way back down here with it, he threw a jug, which is pilot talk for he blew an engine. Luckily for that pilot, he happened to be right over the Winslow, Arizona airport. So he did a one-engine emergency landing. He landed safely at Winslow. It took us 4 weeks to get him a new engine, get it up there, get the airplane repaired, and get him back down here without any further incident. It only cost the museum $19,000. So much for our free airplane. But here's the real story. When this pilot reported having lost an engine over Winslow, turbine engines, that had a propeller attached to the thing, it lifted. Okay, now around to our right-hand side, the shiny yellow airplane that we're looking at is a Snow S2A ag plane. Crop duster. Many of you are familiar with how these guys work. They fly low along the top of the crop that they're spraying, and then they do those big U-turns, turn around and do that over and over again. In order to do that with an airplane, you have to have a couple of things. One of them is a lot of power, so if you look at that big radial engine there, that's a pretty big engine for that little airplane. The other one is great big wings, and that's how you make those airplanes turn like they do. Ahead to our left-hand side, we've got a Sud Aviation Caravel. This was another popular airliner, came out in the early 70s actually as an airliner. The Caravel was actually the first one to put the engines all the way to the rear of the fuselage there, creating much more passenger comfort and quiet inside that jet airliner. Okay, here's one of my favorite airplanes here at the museum on our right-hand side. This is our Baby Clipper. Now, if you flew around the Hawaiian Islands in the late 30s and early 40s, this would have been your airliner. This plane belonged to Hawaii Inter-Island Airways, where it flew along the Hawaiian Islands. Later sold to an Alaskan airline who would use it to fly along the Aleutian chain. 90,000-pound payload on board that big aircraft. Drop-down ramp in the back that would allow for the loading of all things military from the rear of the airplane. A very effective airplane. That's also the type of airplane that was used to bring our Apollo 11 crew home from Hawaii to Houston after having walked on the moon. A couple of presidential airplanes on the right-hand side, and I'll talk about those when we get over in front of them, so have no fear of not skipping them. We'll talk about them in a little bit here. On our left-hand side here, this big silver MATS plane that we're looking at is a Douglas C-54 Skymaster. Now, C-54 was a very good cargo and transport airplane during World War II, but it probably gained most of its fame in 1948 and 1949, performing the Berlin Airlift. When Russia closed Berlin off to the rest of the world by barricading roads and railroads in and out of the city, U.S. pilots and their allies would fly C-54s in and out of Berlin to drop food and water and medical supplies and whatever the Berliners needed to keep them going, up to the point that Russia just finally gave up on that blockade. When this aircraft came into our possession, we removed the floorboards from it. We found coal dust in the belly of that airplane from coal deliveries to Berlin. Over on our right-hand side, this little green bomber that we're looking at is a B-26 Invader. This was a veteran of 3 different wars. The B-26 came out at the end of World War II. Then when it went into Korea as a bomber, and then later in Vietnam, they took the bombardier out of the nose of that airplane and they put in 8 50 caliber machine guns, changing the aircraft designation from a B-26, which B means bomber, to an A-26, which means attack airplane. Attack means that you have machine guns on board and you can blow up ground aircraft. Those actually are not machine guns that you see sticking out of the nose there. That airplane didn't have them when we got it. Those are 8 pieces of 1 1/4 inch PVC that we picked up at Home Depot. That's a C-82 packet over on our left-hand side, a troop transporter and cargo hauler. Favorite paratroopers with that twin tail configuration that you see there. Open up the clamshell doors on the back of the C-82, and the pilots could jump right out the back of that airplane with absolutely no obstructions to the rear. Number 181 on our right-hand side is a PV-2 Harpoon. The Harpoon was a patrol bomber that was used as a close air supporter aircraft in the Pacific and a sub-hunter in the Atlantic. The Harpoon was actually fast enough that he could outrun the Japanese Zeros that would chase him back home. Okay, coming up on our left-hand side, this is another aircraft that you might see in the air while you're out here today. There's our C-130 Hercules. Now, this is the alpha model of the C-130, which means the original version that was built for the U.S. military, believe it or not, folks, back in 1950, 68 years ago. And this aircraft is still being flown by the U.S. military and most of our allies as their utility aircraft. Now, utility aircraft means it does everything. Hospital ship, troop transporter, cargo hauler, mid-air refueler. There's even a gunship version of the C-130 called the Spectre. And upon our last checking in with the construction department out in Marietta, Georgia, who builds the C-130 Hercules, they said they have enough orders to last that airplane for the next 35 years. So that airplane will be over 100 years old when it's finally retired from service. Over on our right-hand side is our HU-16 Albatross that we talked about a little bit earlier. Boat hull design, made to land on water. So obviously used by search and rescue by not only the Air Force, but the Coast Guard, the Marine Corps, the Navy, all had Albatrosses in their inventory to pick up those downed pilots and crewmen as they floated around out on the ocean. Number 213 next to it there is a UC-45 Expediter. This was also a twin-engine trainer and light cargo hauler built off of the civilian Beech 18 design, which was the most popular twin-engine tail dragger back in its day. Over on our left-hand side, look, we've got another C-130 Hercules. This is the D or Delta model of the C-130 that was built to support the 2 line of Greenland, Iceland, and Antarctica. Strap on that unique landing gear that you see here, and now we can perform the full military mission set of the C-130 Hercules. No runway required by landing on the frozen tundra with those skis. Okay, folks, take a look out to the right-hand side. I'm going to talk about that great big airplane that has its tail to us right now. That is the SG-337 Super Guppy. Now, the Super Guppy was built from a modified B-29 bomber airframe, and the whole purpose of that airplane was to haul very large, oversized parts, like Saturn V rocket parts or International Space Station parts, from where they were constructed out in California out to Houston or Florida as needed. Now, the unique feature of the Super Guppy is that the entire nose of that airplane, cockpit and all, swing open on that nose wheel door there like a giant refrigerator door. The whole thing opens up on 2 giant hinges here located on the left-hand side. Now, once that oversized cargo is loaded into the front of that airplane, we can then swing that nose back shut again, batten down the hatches, fire up those 4 big engines, and away we go from coast to coast. As you might imagine by looking at that airplane, it is not very good on gas. Flying from coast to coast might require as many as 4 stops for fuel. Speaking of big airplanes, over on our left-hand side, number 0527 for the Air Force, is our 133 Cargo Master built by Douglas Aircraft for the U.S. Air Force. 110,000-pound payload on board that big airplane. And as you might imagine, the drop-down cargo door in the back there that would allow for the loading of all things military from the rear of that airplane. But in its early days, this airplane would actually suffer from structural failure, cracking along the outside of the fuselage. A couple of them upon landing had the entire nose section break off right in front of the leading edge of the wing there and slide down the runway without the rest of the airplane. Well, it went back to Douglas Aircraft to be redesigned, and when they redesigned this airplane, they incorporated those stainless steel bands that you see wrapped around the fuselage. That cured the cracking problem for the 133, but at the same time, it also gained that airplane the nickname of the Flying Beer Barrel. All right, coming up on our left-hand side now for the Marine Corps, number 826 is our Super Goonie Bird. So DC-3, R4D, C-47, whatever your favorite Goonie Bird configuration is, this is that aircraft on steroids. The Super Goonie has a 40-inch longer nose than a regular DC-3. We've got a little bigger radial engines on board, and now we have fully retractable and fully covered landing gear, where the original Goonie Birds would only retract halfway. So that's our 117 Super Goonie. Over on the right-hand side here, number 4505 for the Coast Guard, is our Fairchild 123 Provider. Now, would you believe me if I told you that when this airplane was first built, it did not have motors? It was actually originally built as a glider. Well, we decided after World War II we didn't really have a lot of use for gliders, so we asked Fairchild to please incorporate engines, which they promptly did. They put one engine under each wing. Now we only have one problem left to solve. Where do we put the fuel? Because when they build a glider, they build a solid wing there, so there's no room for fuel tanks. So if you will look closely behind those big radial engines, you can see some big black pods back there. Those are actually the fuel tanks that feed those big radial engines. Ahead to our left-hand side, another cargo plane for the U.S. Air Force here. This is the C-124 Globemaster. Front opening clamshell doors and a ramp in the front here that would allow an 18-wheeler or tanks or jeeps or whatever military equipment they wanted to put on board that big airplane to be loaded on board. There's an elevator in the back of the 124 that would take up to 100 troops up to the upper deck, where they would be transported intercontinentally. The airplane also features a catwalk down the wings of this big airplane that would allow the flight engineer, or mechanic if you will, to work on those four big engines while the airplane was in flight.
Right on.
This is the P-2 Neptune over on our right-hand side. This was a special use intelligence gathering type of airplane. You can see the infrared camera mounted in the nose there and the radome mounted on the belly, flown by the Air Force and the Navy during Vietnam. The big white airplane ahead to our left-hand side is a Boeing C-97 Stratofreighter. Now, if that looks like a B-29 to anybody, there's actually a pretty good reason for that. We had 800 B-29s left after World War II, and Boeing decided they were going to put them back to work. So what they did was they took the B-29 and they cut the aircraft in half the long way. And then they added this big pressurized capsule to the top of it to make it a fully pressurized airplane. Now, the airlines had a bunch of these, and they called them Strato Cruisers. Now, what I want you to notice on the silver KC-97 is that great big refueling boom that's underneath the tail back there. Everybody see that? Yep. I'm going to talk about that procedure in just a minute, but I don't want to skip our two Navy planes over here on the right-hand side. So let's talk about 197 here for just a second. That is a Grumman S2f Tracker. That was a sub-hunter launched from the deck of an aircraft carrier to go out and look for enemy submarines. Sono buoys and magnetic anomaly detectors on board so they could find submerged enemy submarines. Now, if they were out at night and they happened to find one on the surface, they would illuminate that 70 million candle power lamp that you see on the right wing of the S2F, turning nighttime into day out on the ocean. S2F, Navy guys called that airplane the Stoof. Number 011 right next door is the Stoof with a roof. That is actually the same type of airplane in the early warning configuration. by putting this big radar dome on top of this airplane and then launching it from the deck of an aircraft carrier, we could now extend the Navy's 75 or 80 miles of radar coverage out to about 250 miles to look for enemy vessels or aircraft that were approaching the Navy's fleet. Okay, let's talk about our mid-air refueler over here on the left-hand side. Here's how this guy worked. The KC-97 would go into straight and level flight. The airplane that needed gas would fly up directly behind and below the tail of this aircraft. And then the boomer, who was laying on his belly in the back of the KC-97, would then lower that big refueling boom that we looked at down to about a 40-degree angle. He would then extend it out until he had contact with the refueling receptacle located on the nose of the aircraft in trail. Once he had contact, he could then transfer fuel. Well, here's the problem. This is an old B-29. Most of the aircraft that he would try and refuel would be much faster than him, and as such, they would have a higher stalling speed. So in order to increase that refueling, or increase that airspeed during that mid-air refueling process, the majority would have to be done while the KC-97 was in a dive. Okay, so that's not going to work. So now what do? We take a B-29 and we put two jet engines underneath the wing, like we did earlier. So now we've got it's a B-29 again, but now we've got two jet engines on board. This one is actually called a KC or a KB-50J, and this one used what was called the probe and drogue refueling system. So those two big silver pods that you see out on the wingtips of the airplane, as well as one from the tail of the aircraft, would unreel about 100 feet of fuel hose. And then located at the end of that fuel hose would be a great big basket refueling receptacle that very much resembled like a badminton shuttlecock. And then remember our F-100 Super Sabre and that gooseneck refueling probe that we saw? The pilot of that aircraft would have to fly that probe up into that basket. And then once he had contact, they could then transfer fuel. But again, old B-29, slow aircraft, just wasn't really doing the job for the Air Force. So we needed a better answer. Coming up on our left-hand side is the Air Force's solution to our slow refueler aircraft problem. This is a KC-135. This is the one that the Air Force currently uses as their mid-air refueling aircraft. Plenty of speed with those four big jet engines on the bottom. This is in the civilian world, a Boeing 707. KC-135 is the aircraft that is currently being used by the U.S. Air Force as their mid-air refueling aircraft. Over on our right-hand side, we've got what's called a Ferry Gannet. The Ferry Gannet is a British early warning aircraft. That big pod that you see on the belly there is the radome that allowed them to identify enemy aircraft. Those twin counter-rotating propellers that you see on the front of the Ferry Gannet were used to provide that aircraft with dash speed in order to get him to target very quickly. Once he was on target, he could then feather or turn off one of those propellers to maintain time on target and to save fuel. That is the Ferry Gannet. Now I want y'all to take a look over the back of the Ferry Gannet. There's another KC-135 back there with NASA on the tail. That particular airplane was not a mid-air refueler. NASA called that airplane their weightless wonder, and that was NASA's zero-gravity simulator. So what they did with that airplane is they put their wannabe astronauts in the very heavily padded fuselage in the back of that airplane. The pilot would then take the aircraft up to altitude, and at a given point in time, he would pitch that aircraft over into a parabolic dive. Those wannabe astronauts that were in the back would float around back there, experiencing zero gravity for about 30 seconds or so. Well, the pilot would actually do that about 20 times per takeoff. So those wannabe astronauts not only got to experience weightlessness, they also got to experience air sickness. So that airplane quickly became known by NASA as the Vomit Comet. Number 810 here in Air Force colors is the A-1F Sky Raider, another very popular ground attack airplane flown by the Air Force and the Navy during Vietnam, also used as a ground cover airplane, meaning that if a crew member was shot down, the A-1F Sky Raider would maintain cover over that downed crewman until he was rescued. Over on our left-hand side, we've got our first swept-wing all-jet bomber aircraft for the U.S. Air Force. This is the B-47 Stratojet. Now, 2,000 of these were built between 1947 and 1957 with one specific mission set in mind, and of course that would be the nuclear option. They were designed to carry nukes on board, but again, since that event never occurred actually, a lot of our B-47 ended up being converted into electronic intelligence gathering platforms, as this one was. If you look at that white belly pod on the bottom of the B-47, that's right where the bomb bay would be. So you can tell that this one was converted to do EIG work rather than carry a bomb load. Now look over to our right-hand side. This is the British Shackleton bomber, the cousin of the British Lancaster bomber, converted also to EIG. That ray dome that you see on the belly there is actually the same one that we saw earlier on the Ferry Gannet. And we've got those counter-rotating propellers on board again, also like we saw earlier on the Ferry Gannet. Now on our heading to our right is big gray Air Force number 554 that we're looking at. This is the EC-121 Warning Star, flown by the Air Force right up through Vietnam as another early warning aircraft. That great big pod that you see on the belly there is a radar unit that would look for advancing enemy ground troops. The one that's up on top of the aircraft was used to look for advancing aircraft approaching the U.S. Positions. And if you look back at the tail, you can see the triple tail configuration like we saw earlier on that TWA airplane. In the civilian world, this was actually a Lockheed Super Constellation before being converted to military use. Now on our left-hand side, folks, is the pride and joy of our museum here. This is our B-36 Peacemaker. The U.S. was very concerned during World War II that we were actually going to lose Great Britain to the Nazis. What that meant was that the U.S. would have to have the capability of flying a bomber from North America all the way over to Europe and back without having to stop over on the other side of the globe. Well, the B-36 Peacemaker was designed to perform that mission. This aircraft could go 40 hours from takeoff to landing. The way it was powered to do that would be through those 10 wing-mounted engines that you see on the B-36. 6 propeller-driven engines and 4 J-47 jet engines out on the wingtips. When they were all running, they called it 6 turning and 4 burning to propel the B-36 Peacemaker halfway around the world and back. Stay with me on the left-hand side here. The little gray jet fighter that we're looking at there is the Fallen Gnat, built by the British and flown by most of their European allies. Very capable little jet fighter, also flown by the British Red Arrows flight demonstration team. The aircraft here in German Air Force colors on the left-hand side is the German Alpha Jet, built by the Italians and the Germans. The Italians used it as a jet trainer, and the Germans used it as a jet fighter. And in all, 13 European nations actually flew the Alpha Jet. Okay, folks, spin around to the right-hand side here for a minute. I'm going to talk about that great big ANA airliner that you see over there. The reason why I talk about it over here is because you can see the whole airplane from over here rather than when we get up close to it. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with that airplane, that is the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. That is the world's most sophisticated and most technologically advanced airliner in the business. So now I know what you're going to ask me. What is it doing in a museum? Now the British Lightning was kind of unique. It has 2 engines on the back of it, but they are stacked vertically rather than horizontally. And that big belly pod, if you've got 2 jet engines on board, you need a lot of gas. So that is actually a fuel pod on the belly of it there. Alright, as we roll forward here, coming up on our left-hand side, we've got another B-52 bomber coming up here. This is the G or Golf model of the B-52. And this bomber back in the day was actually capable of carrying a nuclear payload on board. But due to the SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, carrying nuclear devices on board airborne nuclear platforms. All our nukes were taken off of our B-52s. That is not a very key giveaway airplane. That airplane is actually painted that color for a reason. That is a very effective jet fighter flown by the British, and the reason why they painted it that color is because the aircraft was deployed to the pink sands of the North African desert, and in that color it camouflages perfectly. As a matter of fact, American pilots used to say that the only way that they knew that they were overflying a Jaguar was because they could see the shadow of the jet fighter on the desert floor. On our left-hand side is the B-57 Canberra. This was built by Martin Electric, one of 2 foreign-designed aircraft that was flown by the U.S. military, and actually the first jet bomber to drop bombs in combat, the B-57. The big shiny silver one next to it here on the left-hand side, number 080, was our supersonic bomber. As most of you might imagine, most of our bombers back in the day were big and slow. The B-58 Hustler solved that problem. This was a supersonic bomber capable of speeds of up to Mach 2, or 2 times the speed of sound. That big pod that you see on the belly was the fuel pod that would get that bomber to target. Once he was on target, he would then drop that fuel pod, exposing the ordnance or bomb pod underneath. Now on our right-hand side, folks, we've got a whole bunch of Russian MiGs all in a row. The first one there is in Egyptian Air Force colors, and that's the MiG-19 Farmer, swept-wing fighter, used right up through the Vietnam War. The next two, numbers 1905 and 634, are the older brother of the MiG-19. Those are MiG-17s. Number 1905 is the daytime gunship version of the MiG-17. 634 is the all-weather night fighter version. That yellow dome in the nose there houses a radar unit that allowed that pilot to operate that aircraft in the dark and in bad weather. The silver number 69 was the most widely produced MiG fighter of them all, the MiG-21 Fishbed. Over 12,000 of those were built by the Russians, flown by them and their communist allies. Okay, for those of you that can see ahead of our tram, the C-130 Hercules is making another pass there, and he'll end up over high and right for those of you in the back of the tram car there. And, I'll give you just a minute there so you can see him on final approach there to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. Okay, so now over on our, heading to our right-hand side is the current day or modern day MiG jet fighter, the MiG-29 Fulcrum, primary adversary of American-made F-15s, F-16s, and F-18s, although no U.S. pilot has ever been shot down by MiG-29. Coming up on our left-hand side, folks, we've got a bunch of helicopters. Welcome to my world. The first one is a UH-19 Chickasaw, used as a rescue helicopter, flown by the Air Force and also by the Navy and the Coast Guard. An external rescue hook would be lowered down to that downed crewman and then hoist him up and on board. The next two Army helicopters, a couple of Vietnam-era aircraft, the OH-58 Kiowa and the UH-1 Huey. The Kiowa was flown as a scout helicopter. Army pilots flew that up the Ho Chi Minh Trail, attempting to draw gunfire. Once they did that, they would call those coordinates into a gunship that would hopefully come in and destroy the ground target. Now, the gunship that they were most likely to call in over in Vietnam would be that one right next to it there. That is the Huey, or the UH-1 Iroquois, and it did virtually everything over in Vietnam. This one's in the dust-off configuration, which is the hospital ship, but it was also their primary troop transporter, cargo hauler, mail go-getter, did pretty much everything over in Vietnam, and that is why 45 years later, the Huey still remains in U.S. military inventory. The two next to the Huey are Kamen Huskies, and Huskies were also search and rescue helicopters featuring that external rescue hook, but they kind of re-established helicopter flight in that they had twin counter-rotating main rotor blades, which actually eliminated the need for a tail rotor or anti-torque blade like unconventional helicopters. The next two Sikorsky amphibious helicopters, the H-52 Seaguard and the H-3 Pelican, boat hull designs made to land on water, but more frequently would be used by hovering over that downed crewman and lowering that external rescue hook. The next two are a pair of Piasecki transport helicopters. The Piaseckis had front and rear mounted main rotor blades to provide that heavy payload lift on board. The Little Orange Navy helicopter is a Bell H-7 Sioux. Navy pilots would be trained to fly helicopters in a Sioux and then graduate to a larger helicopter afterwards. The last two on the left here are a pair of Korean War-era Sikorsky Dragonflies, again featuring that external rescue hook. The big green Army helicopter on the right-hand side is a CH-54 Tarhe, better known as the Sky Crane, flown by Army pilots during the Vietnam War to deliver up to 20,000-pound cargo containers to the fire bases in Vietnam. The helicopter was actually big enough that it could pick up a downed aircraft and return it to the fire base as needed. Although they've been retired by the Army, you will still see them in civilian use today in the logging and firefighting industries. Okay, swing around to the left-hand side. That pretty gray helicopter back in the corner is the MH-53 Pave Low helicopter. Built from the Air Force's Jolly Green Giant design, a A lot of sophistication and technology would go into that airframe to make it a favorite of special forces around the world. As a matter of fact, it was a modified version of the Pave low helicopter the U.S. Special Forces used to assault the Osama bin Laden combat. And in East German Air Force colors here on the left-hand side is the Russian attack helicopter, the Mi-24D Hind helicopter. This aircraft could accommodate up to 8 troops on board. Normally, if you saw one of these in service, it was probably in the combat or attack configuration. Those winglets on either side would be very heavily loaded with missiles or rockets, and that Gatling gun sticking out the nose there would be fully loaded and ready for combat. The Hind helicopter. And finally, the Army's tired dude here on the left-hand side, CH-37 Mojave. Transport helicopter flown by the Army right up to Vietnam. Okay, folks, we talked about our B-52 being taken out of service by means of the Russian SALT Treaty. Coming up on our left-hand side, we actually have another victim of the SALT Treaty. This is the Ground Launch Cruise Missile System, GLCM as it's known, and we actually had these missiles deployed throughout Europe in the early 80s. Well, Russia did not like the fact that we had the capability of having a Tomahawk cruise missile, or Griffin as they were called when they were ground-mounted, somewhere in Europe, and then on virtually a moment's notice being able to move this missile battery entirely somewhere else by means of these green ground support vehicles that you see here. So as a condition, or another condition of the SALT Treaty with Russia, the Ground Launch Cruise Missile System was also removed later in years to come. Right next to it there, the grade number 88 in Marine Corps paint that we're looking at is the A4D Skyhawk. That was a Vietnam Eurofighter aircraft that was originally built for the U.S. Navy as a carrier-based fighter attack airplane and then adopted by the Marine Corps as a ground attack airplane. That is the type of airplane that our Arizona Senator John McCain was flying when he was shot down over Hanoi and became a guest of the Hanoi Hilton for about 5.5 years. Over on our right-hand side, that grade number 29 that we're looking at, the DF-8 Crusader, another carrier-based Navy airplane called the last of the gunfighters. Remember how we talked about the F-4 Phantoms not having guns on board? If you look right behind the number 29 of the DF-8 Crusader, you can see machine gun ports there. That would be the last military aircraft to have machine gun ports on board for many years to come, the DF-8 Crusader. And by the way, the Navy's first 1,000-mile-an-hour jet airplane. The two next to it there on the right-hand side, the white, orange, and blue ones, are the F-9 Grumman Cougar, Korean War era jet fighters for the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps. Number 386 is that solo pilot gunship version. Number 517 is the double bubble canopy trainer version of that Navy jet fighter. Back around to the left-hand side, the grade number 506 is the EA-6B Intruder, EA-6E actually. The Intruder was a precision-guided bomber flown by the Navy and Marine Corps just up until, actually, the last one retired just a few years ago. Laser-guided bombing system. You can see that dome on the nose there. That actually has a laser inside of it. The pilot would fire that beam onto a target as small as a Volkswagen Beetle. And actually, not only his bombs, but all the aircraft that were in his flight. The EA-6B next to it here, the Prowler, is his older brother. That was used as a radio jamming aircraft. He could jam communication and radio guidance systems on board the enemy aircraft with that EA-6B. 315 is also a reconnaissance airplane. That's an RF-5 vigilante. You see the camera mounted on the belly of the gun. The F-6 of those two little orange and white jet fighters that we looked at a few airplanes back. They found that by sweeping the wings like they did on those two orange and white fighters, they increased the airspeed of the this particular aircraft by nearly 100 miles per hour. Now, speaking of Air Force One, we're coming up on 2 more presidential airplanes. One of these aircraft is indeed an Air Force One, meaning president on board, and one is not. And I'm going to show you how to tell the difference between the two. But the first one that we're looking at here is a Boeing 707, or VC-137 in the VIP configuration. And that airplane is known as Freedom One. And the reason that airplane got that nickname is this is the airplane, folks, that back in 1981 went over and picked up our 52 Iranian hostages after 444 days in captivity. This is the airplane they came home on. Upon arriving in U.S. airspace, the controller greeted that airplane with "Welcome Home, Freedom One." And that name actually stuck with that airplane. Now, Freedom One is actually not an Air Force One, and here's how you tell the difference. If you look ahead to that propeller-driven DC-6 or VC-118 in the VIP configuration, that airplane is indeed an Air Force One. Here's how you tell. The Kennedy paint scheme that you are looking at on these 2 airplanes that was designed by Jacqueline Kennedy and is still in use today on President Trump's airplane. If you look at the propeller-driven DC-6, you can see that that blue stripe that runs down the side of the airplane actually goes up and over the top of the pilot's canopy, indicating that the propeller-driven DC-6 is indeed an Air Force One, or president on board. Now, if you look back at Freedom One, you can see that the white paint goes all the way over the top of the airplane, indicating that Freedom One is a staff or support airplane that could be substituted for Air Force One, but probably most likely flown by the Vice President or members of Congress. So the propeller-driven DC-6 that you're looking at there is indeed an Air Force One. That belonged to Presidents Kennedy and President Johnson. And even after getting their Boeing jet, they would continue to fly the propeller-driven airplane around the country to get them in and out of the smaller airports that at the time could not accommodate the big Boeing jet. Speaking of big Boeing jets, on our left-hand side in China's southern paint, we've got a Boeing 737 built by the Boeing Company of Seattle back in 1962. So 56 years later, if you fly on Southwest Airlines, you are still flying on a Boeing 737, the most popular and most widely used airliner in the business. This funny-looking airplane on our right-hand side is a Beech 2000 Starship. Built by a fellow named, or designed by a fellow named Burt Rutan back in the early 80s, kind of known for building unusual aircraft. Well, that one certainly is unusual. They pushed the tail surface up to the nose. They called it a canard design. They moved the tail feathers out to the wingtips, and then they turned the motors around. Unfortunately for Mr. Rutan and Beechcraft, at the time they were getting this aircraft out of production, Lear had come out with the Lear jet, and Cessna had come out with a Citation jet. So most people wanted to be flown around on jets, so propeller-driven aircraft were no longer in production, or in demand, I should say. So the silver airplane here with the yellow ring around the nose is our F-86 Sabre. That is the Korean War hero that was flown by our Air Force guys during the Korean War. That was our MiG killer and the aircraft that did most of the work for our Air Force guys over there. The one next to it there with the big black nose is its night fighter brother. That big black nose houses the radome, or the radar unit that allowed that Air Force pilot to operate that aircraft in the dark and in bad weather. And now we are up to our F-89 Scorpion, I'm sorry, our F-94 Starfire. The Starfire had 24 Mighty Mouse unguided rockets on board. So what this jet pilot would do is he would get up behind the bad guy, and then he would fire off all 24 of those rockets all at once. And then hopefully get out of the way, because those were unguided rockets, as I stated earlier. Next to it is the F-89 Scorpion, so named because of its tail configuration there. The Scorpion, not only an all-weather fighter flown by the U.S. Air Force, but this one actually had the payload of the Genie nuke rocket that you can see mounted underneath the wing there. Another very capable all-weather fighter flown by the Air Force. This is the attack version. You will see those Marine Corps Air Station pilots currently flying out of Yuma. That's the AV-8C Harrier jump jet. And then, of course, you don't learn to fly vertical takeoff and landing aircraft overnight, so you have to build a two-seat trainer version. And that's what we're looking at here with number 04. We've got a two-seat trainer there. Again, folks, a lot of aircraft left to see here. If you haven't been out into hangars 3, 4, and 5, some of our best aircraft are located out in those hangars, so do not miss those. Also, the restaurant is open for business. If you're getting hungry, stop in there. I can tell you firsthand that the food is more than adequate.
This is